प्रो अमेरिकन हो जाइए, सब ठीक हो जाएगा। आप वॉशिंग पाउडर है, धुल के एकदम साफ सुथरे पाक साफ हो जाएंगे, कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं है, फिर आप टेररिस्ट नहीं रहेंगे। ये एक पैरामीटर है, एंड दिस इज डिस्गस्टिंग, दिस इज रिडिकुलस। Hello, dear students, and welcome to another lecture. And the topic of this lecture is very interesting. Interesting in the sense that whatever is happening today in the world has a direct nexus with what I am going to discuss with you today in this lecture. And perhaps this is not what it seems to be. You know, what is written here and what we are going to discuss is something which is just on the face. But the real contexts and the real truths lies behind those curtains. Okay, so the question is now, the topic that we are going to discuss is war on terror, and it was started by a government, a country that itself sponsored terrorism across the world. So it's going to be very interesting because it has a direct connection with whatever is happening in the West Asia, whatever happened in Afghanistan, whatever happened in Iraq. All these things have a direct connection with this. So the question is that war on terror is what and who started it? Let us discuss. Introduction. After the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, the Bush administration, George Bush, he was the then president of the United States, declared a worldwide war on terror involving open and covert military operations, new security legislation, efforts to block the financing of terrorism, and more. So, war on terror started post 9/11 attack. There was a, a brutal terrorist attack on World Trade Center in New York on September 11, 2001. And after that, George Bush started this war on terror, a worldwide campaign called War on Terror, which involved open and covert military operations. That means open and covert means hidden and open. Covert means hidden, covered. Open and covert military operations, new security legislations, that means new laws were legislated both at the national and international level, because United States always pitched for bringing some new legislations that would block terrorism. Okay, however, when it was actually brought before the United Nations General Assembly, the United States was just one party to abstain from it and to walk out from accepting those definitions of terrorism, because in the given definition of the terrorism, these activities of the United States is squarely fitted into. So that is why new security legislations, efforts to block the financing of terrorism, and more. So efforts must be made to block the financing of terrorism. Whoever supplies the guns and weapons and money to the terrorist organizations, it must be blocked somewhere. From whatever channel it is coming, it must be stopped. Washington called on other states to join in the fight against terrorism, asserting that either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. There is no middle ground. United States said there is no middle ground. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. That's it. Many governments joined this campaign, often adopting harsh new laws, lifting long-standing legal protections, and stepping up domestic policing and intelligence work. The War on Terror is an international military campaign launched in 2001 with the US and UK invasion of Afghanistan in response to the attacks on New York and Washington of 11th September 2001. It was followed by an invasion of Iraq. It was followed by, in 2001, it was followed by, in 2002, it was followed by invasion of Iraq. Iraq was bombed when it was ruled by the dictator Saddam Hussein. It is a global military, political, legal, and ideological struggle employed against organizations designated as terrorist and regimes that were accused of having a connection to terrorists or presented as posing a threat to the United States and its allies in general. So it was not only a military operation, simple military operation to finish off all the terrorist organizations, but rather it was a step as well political step as well, because United States wanted to create its political and economic hegemony across the world, and that's what it has been successful in doing so. So political हेजेमनी के लिए एक एफर्ट था, लीगल एंड आइडियोलॉजिकल स्ट्रगल दैट लॉज मस्ट बी ब्रॉट व्हिच आर एंटी टेररिज्म. Okay, and ideological struggle means what, for example, if this military operations carried out in the name of war on terror, they finish off certain organizations of terrorists. For example, they finish all the terrorist organizations of the terrorists, all the terrorist organizations in the world. Then what happened? Someone else would rise up in the future and would create another organizations, because organizations were finished, the ideology did not. So it was an attack on the ideology also. Okay, ideological struggle employed against organizations designated as terrorists and regimes that were accused of having a connection to terrorists or presented as posing a threat to the US and its allies in general. Now, what you have to focus upon is that, interestingly, United States started war on terror without having a concrete definition of terrorism in its own laws, nor there is any concrete and proper definition of terrorism at the international level, in the international law. So international law has failed to define terrorism. The domestic laws of the countries have failed to define terrorism. Terrorism is something vague and undefined till now, and countries are fighting against it. This is the biggest irony. This is the biggest irony. And one thing more you have to focus upon, that designators as terrorists. You are designating an organization or a person as a terrorist organization or a terrorist. Then if you do not have a definition, how and on what parameters, on what grounds are you designating a person as a terrorist? If you do not have any definition of terrorism, then how could you designate a person as a terrorist, or an organization as a terrorist organization? Okay, let us focus on another point. Posing a threat to the US and its allies in general. That means United States had one parameter of defining terrorism, that whatever country, whichever organization stands against United States comes out to be a terrorist. That means United States became a touchstone that whosoever opposes United States and its political and economic hegemony would be designated as a terrorist. This is something ridiculous, because this is against the principles of sovereignty of nations. Every country is sovereign. I am a sovereign nation. I may not be interested in befriending United States. I may not like its policies. Why should I extend my hand of friendship to a country which was involved, according to me, according to my staunch beliefs, it was involved in sponsoring terrorist organizations in Afghanistan and Iraq? Why would I be interested in befriending a country that has created its political and economic hegemony and wants all the countries of the world to follow it? I should not. So that means the US had one parameter of designating people and organizations as terrorists. That means that whatever or whichever person, whoever stands against United States is going to be designated as a terrorist. The phrase war on terror was adopted by former US President George W. Bush and other high-ranking US officials. The campaign was led by United States and UK with the support of other North Atlantic Treaty Organizations, NATO countries. Right now, there are NATO forces which are in direct collision with the resistance forces in Lebanon and Palestine right now, and non-NATO countries. NATO is a treaty, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a group of countries. Right now there are around 32 members, 32 countries as members of NATO, like for example Denmark, France, Germany, Finland, Italy, Canada. There are some North American countries, there are European countries, and the countries who are willing to join the NATO in like recently are Bosnia and Ukraine. And that is why Russia did not want Ukraine to join NATO, because Ukraine was born out of USSR, broken USSR. So Russia did not want Ukraine to join NATO because it is an opposite group. Russia is an anti, it belongs to the Warsaw Pact group. So it did not want Ukraine to join NATO. So that is why, see, NATO countries, इसमें एक प्रिंसिपल है, आर्टिकल 5 में इसके ये है कि अगर किसी एक नाटो कंट्री के ऊपर अटैक होता है तो इट विल बी डीम्ड एन अटैक ऑन ऑल द कंट्रीज एंड ऑल द कंट्रीज विल स्टैंड अप इन डिफेंस together. And non-NATO countries. The campaign was originally carried on against Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations with the purpose of eliminating them. It is also known as the Global War on Terror or the War on Terrorism. The term war on terror is ubiquitous, but the meaning of the word war has evolved. Okay. For most of the last 2000 years, war has meant something very conventional and traditional. The current war on terror, however, is a completely unconventional, non-traditional type of conflict. Georgetown University historian Bruce Hoffman says, unlike traditional wars, the war on terror does not have a clear beginning and an end. War ends with the vanquishing of an opponent with some form or armistice or truce, some kind of surrender instrument or document. See, Bruce Hoffman, he's a professor in Georgetown University, and he defines war. War is a unlike traditional wars, the war and see, he says that war ends with vanquishing of an opponent. जब opponent खत्म हो जाए, war खत्म हो गई. War ends with the vanquishing, उसे war कहते हैं. War ends with the vanquishing of an opponent with some form or armistice or truce. With some form, यानी कि या तो opponent खत्म हो जाए या फिर दोनों के बीच में ट्रीटी हो जाए, आर्मिस्टिस या ट्रूस, पीस हो जाए, दोनों की सीज फायर हो जाए, ठीक है आप भी ठीक है, आप हम भी रहेंगे, कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं है, दोस्ती हो गई, खत्म हो गई बात. सम काइंड ऑफ सरेंडर इंस्ट्रूमेंट और डॉक्यूमेंट, या सरेंडर हो जाए या डॉक्यूमेंट तय हो जाए दोनों के बीच में, ठीक है. सो ब्रूस हॉफमैन का कहना है, say the war ends with vanquishing of an opponent with some form or armistice or truce, some kind of surrender instrument or document. अब लेकिन ब्रूस हॉफमैन कहते हैं अगर ये डेफिनेशन होती है वॉर की, वॉर ऑन टेरर कोई कॉन्क्रीट वॉर नहीं है, ना तो इसकी कोई स्पेसिफिक बिगनिंग है, ना इसका कोई स्पेसिफिक एंड है. Okay, Hoffman says, but in the war on terror, there is no specific battlefield and the enemy isn't an army. कोई enemy जो है कोई आर्मी नहीं है. बिल्कुल कोई कहीं टेररिस्ट ऑर्गेनाइजेशन अफगानिस्तान में, कोई बंदे कहीं बैठे हैं, कोई कहीं बैठा है, कोई कहीं है, ऐसे मतलब नॉर्मल बस चल रहा है. ओके, इट इज अ वॉर विदाउट बाउंड्रीज. विदाउट बाउंड्रीज. वॉर बाउंड्रीज के बीच में, इंडो चाइना वॉर हुई, बाउंड्रीज में हुई, आर्मीज के बीच में हुई. इंडो पाक वॉर हुई, आर्मीज के बीच में हुई, बाउंड्रीज के बीच में हुई. लेकिन यहां कोई बाउंड्री ही नहीं है ना. कोई इराक में है, कोई अफगानिस्तान में, कोई पाकिस्तान के एबटाबाद में है, कोई कहीं पर बैठा है, कोई कहीं पर बैठा है, कुछ पता ही नहीं है ना. सो इट्स अ वॉर डायरेक्टेड अगेंस्ट मल्टीपल एनिमीज, नॉट जस्ट वन एडवर्सरी. इट्स अ वॉर directed against multiple enemies, not just one adversary. The war on terrorism was a multi-dimensional campaign of almost limitless scope. Its military dimension involved major wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, covert operations in Yemen and elsewhere, large-scale military assistance programs for cooperative regimes, and major increases in military spending. It's now large-scale military assistance programs for cooperative regimes. Cooperative regimes, the regimes who had come in coalition with the United States for war on terror, for conducting war on terror, and major increases in military spending. They all together started spending lavishly on the military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq and Yemen. Its intelligence dimension comprised institutional reorganization and considerable increases in the funding of America's intelligence gathering capabilities, a global program of capturing terrorist suspects and interning them at Guantanamo Bay. See, that's very interesting. Its intelligence dimension comprised institutional reorganization and considerable increases in the funding of America's intelligence gathering capabilities. So first of all, the United States strengthened its own intelligence gathering capabilities. Okay, institutional reorganizations, they reshuffled something, they fine-tuned their system, and they strengthened their intelligence gathering capabilities. And it was a global program of capturing terrorist suspects and interning them. It was a global program of capturing terrorist suspects. How to capture terrorist suspects? And they all were, these military personnel, they all were interned at Guantanamo Bay. Expanded cooperation with foreign intelligence agencies, the expanded cooperation, like for example CIA started cooperating with Mossad, and it started cooperating with MI6 of Britain, and it started cooperating with other intelligence organizations of foreign intelligence agencies, and the tracking and interception of terrorist financing. How to track, कहां से पैसा जा रहा है, एंड इंटरसेप्ट करना, उसको रोकना है, पकड़ना है, ये पैसा जा रहा है, इसने इसको पैसा दिया, टेररिस्ट ऑर्गेनाइजेशन को पैसा दिया. ओके, terrorist financing. Its diplomatic dimension included continuing efforts to construct and maintain a global coalition of partner states and organizations, and an extensive public diplomacy campaign to counter anti-Americanism in the Middle East. So, its diplomatic dimension included continuing efforts to construct and maintain a global coalition of partner states and organizations, and an extensive public diplomacy campaign to counter anti-Americanism in the Middle East. अब देखिए यहां पर डिप्लोमैटिक लेवल पर क्या हो रहा था, ठीक है, जहां पर डिप्लोमैट्स भेज जाते, डिप्लोमैटिक डायमेंशन में क्या क्या हुआ, कौन कौन से एफर्ट्स थे, कंस्ट्रक्ट एंड मेंटेन अ ग्लोबल कोलिशन ऑफ पार्टनर स्टेट्स, सबसे दोस्ती करनी है, सबसे डिप्लोमैटिक रिलेशंस बनने, जो पार्टनर हैं, जो साथ में आए हैं, एंड ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस, एन एक्सटेंसिव पब्लिक डिप्लोमेसी कैंपेन टू काउंटर एंटी अमेरिकनिज्म इन द मिडिल ईस्ट. और जो भी एंटी अमेरिकन फीलिंग है मिडिल ईस्ट के अंदर, वेस्ट एशिया के अंदर, उसको फिनिश करना है. मैंने आपको बताया ना, यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स का एक ही पैरामीटर है टू डिफाइन टेररिज्म, एंड व्हाट इज दैट, एंटी अमेरिकन जो भी है वो टेररिस्ट है. एंटी अमेरिकनिज्म इन द मिडिल ईस्ट, टू काउंटर एंटी अमेरिकनिज्म इन द मिडिल ईस्ट. यानी कि डिप्लोमैटिक रिलेशन से, डिप्लोमेसी से, पब्लिक डिप्लोमेसी से ये एंटी अमेरिकनिज्म की जो भावना थी उसको खत्म करना चाह रहे थे, और सबको प्रो अमेरिकन बनाना चाहिए. प्रो अमेरिकन हो जाइए, सब ठीक हो जाएगा, आप वॉशिंग पाउडर है, धुल के एकदम साफ सुथरे पाक साफ हो जाएंगे, कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं है, फिर आप टेररिस्ट नहीं रहेंगे. ये एक पैरामीटर है, एंड दिस इज डिस्गस्टिंग, दिस इज रिडिकुलस. The domestic dimension of United States war on terrorism entailed new anti-terrorism legislation such as the USA Patriot Act. See, USA Patriot Act, new security institutions such as the Department of Homeland Security, the preventive detainment of thousands of suspects, surveillance and intelligence gathering programs by the National Security Agency, the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, and local authorities, the strengthening of emergency response procedures, and increased security measures for airports, borders, and public events. अब यहां पर यूएसए का एक पैट्रियट एक्ट आ गया, ठीक है, न्यू सिक्योरिटी इंस्टीट्यूशंस आ गए, नए नए इंस्टीट्यूशंस एस्टैब्लिश कर दिए, ठीक है, डिपार्टमेंट ऑफ होमलैंड सिक्योरिटी आ गया, प्रिवेंटिव डिटेनमेंट ऑफ थाउजेंड्स ऑफ सस्पेक्ट्स, प्रिवेंटिव डिटेंशन आ गया, पहले ही पकड़ लिया, ये सस्पेक्ट, इसको पकड़ लो, कांड करने से पहले ही पकड़ लो, ठीक है. सर्वेलेंस एंड इंटेलिजेंस गैदरिंग प्रोग्राम्स बाय द एनएसए, सर्वेलेंस और इंटेलिजेंस गैदरिंग प्रोग्राम्स स्टार्ट किए नेशनल सिक्योरिटी एजेंसी के साथ, फेडरल ब्यूरो ऑफ इन्वेस्टिगेशन के साथ, एंड लोकल अथॉरिटीज. द स्ट्रेंथनिंग ऑफ इमरजेंसी रिस्पॉन्स प्रोसीजर्स, द स्ट्रेंथनिंग ऑफ इमरजेंसी रिस्पॉन्स प्रोसीजर्स, strengthening of emergency response procedures, and increased security measures for airports, borders, and public emergency response. अटैक होगा, emergency response procedure होना चाहिए. Increased security measures for airports, borders, and public events. Timeline chronology on war on terror. Okay. अभी देखें criticism of war on terror. अभी यहां पर हमने जो टाइमलाइन है वो तो इसके अंदर है, हम बाद में इसको डिस्कस करेंगे, लेकिन हम क्रिटिसिज्म्स देख लेते हैं. क्रिटिक्स आर्ग्यूड दैट, अब इसको हम शॉर्ट में फिनिश करते हैं. क्रिटिक्स आर्ग्यूड दैट द फेलियर्स ऑफ अमेरिका's काउंटर टेररिज्म कैंपेन आउटवेड्स इट्स सक्सेसेस. दे कंटेंडेड दैट द वॉर इन अफगानिस्तान हैड इफेक्टिवली scattered the Al-Qaeda network, thereby making it even harder to counteract, and that the attacks in Afghanistan and Iraq had increased anti-Americanism among the world's Muslims, thereby amplifying the message of militant Islam and uniting disparate groups in a common cause. That's very interesting. Critics ने कहा कि अमेरिका काउंटर टेररिज्म कैंपेन जो है आउटवेड इट सक्सेस. वॉर इन अफगानिस्तान हैड इफेक्टिवली स्कैटर्ड द अलकायदा नेटवर्क. अलकायदा को तो आपने बिखेर दिया, ठीक है, thereby making it even harder to counteract, and that the attacks in Afghanistan and Iraq had increased anti-Americanism. Attacks in Afghanistan and Iraq had increased anti-Americanism among the world's Muslims. ठीक है, और इसने क्रिटिक्स का ही कहना है आप एंटी अमेरिकनिज्म की भावना को खत्म करने आए थे, इसने एंटी अमेरिकनिज्म की भावना को बढ़ा दिया. अफगानिस्तान में आपने अटैक किया, उसने बढ़ा दिया. मुस्लिम्स के अंदर एक भावना उत्पन्न हो चुकी है एंटी अमेरिकन, और thereby amplifying the message of militant Islam and uniting desperate groups in a common cause. देखिए, militant Islam कुछ नहीं होता. militant Islam क्या होता है? What is militant Islam? इस्लाम में जो जिहाद का कॉन्सेप्ट है वो सिर्फ डिफेंसिव जिहाद है. If somebody is attacking you, you should defend. You have full right to defend your land and your person. There is no religion that stops you from exercising your right of defense. Then why Islam should be singled out as a religion that is labeled as a militant religion? Absolutely not. America wants to capture you. America wants to make you its slave mentally, physically, militarily, economically, and in every single manner. And still you want to praise America for no reasons. The concept of Islamic concept of Islamic republics in the West Asia was, why should we worship America when we are self-sufficient, when we are sovereign? What is the point in worshipping America? Okay. So other critics allege that the war on terror was a contrived smokescreen for the pursuit of a larger US geopolitical agenda that included controlling global oil reserves, increasing defense spending, expanding the country's international military presence, and countering the strategic challenge posed by various regional powers. US geopolitical agenda. बाकी क्रिटिक्स ने क्या कहा कि ये पॉलिटिकल जियोपॉलिटिकल एजेंडा था, कुछ नहीं था. बुश ने खुद अटैक करवाया और उसके बाद उसको बहाना बना के वॉर ऑन टेरर स्टार्ट करवा दिया. जियोपॉलिटिकल एजेंडा है. क्यों? क्योंकि ग्लोबल ऑयल रिजर्व्स वेस्ट एशिया के अंदर है. पूरी इकोनॉमी, जबरदस्त इकोनॉमी, पेट्रो करेंसी डॉलर है. वो चाहता है ग्लोबल ऑयल रिजर्व्स को पूरी तरह कैप्चर कर ले. इंक्रीजिंग डिफेंस स्पेंडिंग, डिफेंस पर स्पेंड करे अपने. एक्सपैंडिंग द कंट्रीज इंटरनेशनल मिलिट्री प्रेजेंस, और उसकी जो मिलिट्री प्रेजेंस है वो इंटरनेशनल हो जाए. अफगानिस्तान में भी यूएस की आर्मी मौजूद रहे, इराक में भी मौजूद रहे, ईरान में भी मौजूद रहे, सीरिया में भी रहे, यमन में भी रहे, लेबनान में भी रहे, फलस्तीन में भी रहे, हर जगह रहे, ताकि उसकी जो पॉलिसी है वो मिलिट्री, जो उसकी फॉरेन पॉलिसी वो सिर्फ मिलिट्री माइंड के ऊपर चल रही है. एंड काउंटरिंग द स्ट्रेटेजिक चैलेंज पोज्ड बाय वेरियस रीजनल पावर्स, जो भी रीजनल पावर्स हैं उनको काउंटर करना है. When the US first invaded Iraq in 2003, the president's rationale was that Iraq had ties to Al-Qaeda, a claim that was later debunked by improved intelligence. पहले कह दिया अलकायदा से लेंगे, फिर वो बात खत्म हो गई. Later the rationale was to get rid of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be non-existent. Critics have argued that US actions in Iraq and Afghanistan have galvanized terrorist groups by more clearly defining the United States as their enemy, and have also inspired ire from the international community. By the time of US President George Bush re-election in 2004, the drawbacks of the war on terror were becoming apparent. In Iraq, US forces had overthrown the government of Saddam Hussein in 2003, and US war planners had underestimated the difficulties of building a functioning government from scratch and neglected to consider how this effort could be complicated by Iraq's sectarian tensions, which had been held in check by Saddam's repressive regime but were unleashed by his removal. By late 2004, it was clear that Iraq was sinking into chaos and civil war. Estimates of the number of Iraqi civilians killed during the period of maximum violence, roughly 2004 to 2007, vary widely but generally exceed 2 lakh. US casualties during this period far outnumbered those suffered during the initial 2003 invasion. Afghanistan, which for several years had seemed to be under control, soon followed a similar trajectory, and by 2006 the US was facing a full-blown insurgency there led by a reconstituted Taliban. See, ये कुछ हो नहीं पाया, इसमें कोई सक्सेस नहीं मिली है. Okay. The Bush administration faced domestic and international criticism for actions that it deemed necessary to fight terrorism, but which critics considered to be immoral, illegal, or both. Okay, by the last years of Bush presidency, public opinion had turned strongly negative concerning his handling of the Iraq war and the other national security matters. They were He was badly defeated, and it is worth noting that beneath Obama's rejection of the war on terror as a rhetorical device and as a conceptual framework for national security, there were important continuities with the policies of his predecessor. The Obama administration, for example, greatly expanded the campaign of targeted killings carried out with drones, even eliminating several US citizens abroad whom it deemed threatening. So, I mean, these are the human cost of war on terror. It was like it's a big thing that we can it's going to be quite lengthy. Human rights violations during war on terror, we can discuss them later in some other lecture. And let us come to the point that apart from, see, everybody was being interned at Guantanamo Bay. So apart from Guantanamo Bay, the other issue or incident that gave the public a peek of what happens in prisons in US administered countries was the example of notorious Abu Ghraib scandal. Okay, so CBS News broke the story and broadcasted a series of pictures from the Abu Ghraib prison. I mean, US itself had been involved in various kinds of human rights violations, aggressive human rights violations, but still it wants to portray that it is the defender of human rights and a keeper of democracy. So that's it. That's all. And we would like you to subscribe this channel, scan this QR, and subscribe the YouTube channel of Paathshala. Okay, thank you so much.